right, I'm ready to roll. Good evening and a warm welcome to our distinguished Japanese guest today for the webinar that's organized by the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. I am Sujan Chinoy, a former ambassador of India to Japan, among other things. And today the topic of our webinar is Japan's future security outlook in the Indo-Pacific. We have with us a very distinguished lineup today. We have Mr. Jun Isomura, Senior Fellow from the Hudson Institute, Washington, D.C. Mr. Tosh Minohara, Professor from Kobe University. Mr. Tsuneo Watanabe, Senior Fellow from the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. And Mr. Yoichiro Sato, Professor from the Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University. I take this opportunity to also greet all the others who have joined us. The key objective of this webinar is to explore the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, on the geopolitical and geoeconomic architecture that's emerging in the Indo-Pacific. Japan, as you all know, is a key pillar in the conceptualization of the Indo-Pacific. We all recall the fact that Prime Minister Abe had visited India and made a landmark speech in 2007 on the confluence of the two seas in his address to the joint session of the Indian Parliament. And it's only natural that we discuss this theme between India and Japan in view of our very strong partnership. As India's ambassador to Japan between 2015 and 2018, I had a ringside view of developments in the region, apart from trying to give traction to our bilateral ties in the context of India-Japan Vision 2025 in the Indo-Pacific. Since leaving Tokyo, I've been with the IDSA, this institute, which has a great reputation, which is also very well integrated and connected to institutions and scholars in Japan as elsewhere. And here too, we are making efforts to promote our bilateral, what we call the India-Japan Special Strategic and Global Partnership. I recall the words of Prime Minister Modi, who had said in his address to the Business Leaders Forum in 2018 that Japan and India will play a major role in Asia's emergence. And I also recall what Prime Minister Abe had said, which is that robust relations between Japan and India are a public good. As two of Asia's largest democracies, we have shared values that emphasize openness and transparency, rule of law, freedom of navigation and commerce in the Indo-Pacific region. And as things stand, the Quad, which is strictly speaking one of the many plurilateral structures that exist, also has a similar convergence between the four nations that are part of the Quad. This convergence on openness, transparency, on freedom of navigation and overflight, on a growing inclusiveness to the definition and dialogue within the Indo-Pacific region. Now, I think that we live in very uncertain times, very difficult times where change is the only constant. But even amidst all this uncertainty, I would imagine there are very few who would dispute the fact that friendship and cooperation between India and Japan has remained very constant. And there are a few other points that I would like to place before the panelists before they take off. Japan, in the context of the coronavirus, I can say with confidence that it's no stranger to handling crisis. Whether the nuclear destruction of the horrific destruction in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, or the triple disaster of 2011, it's a resilient nation. Japan is a formidable and resilient nation, and it has Phoenix-like risen from great challenges in the past as well. Today, it's confronting COVID-19 like all others around the world. COVID has wreaked havoc on economic and financial systems all over the world. And Japan may not have yet suffered an explosive spread of the virus, but is certainly not sheltered from the raging global pandemic either. COVID-19 received a kind of high rating head start with television screens showing the cruise liner, the Diamond Princess, in Tokyo, with all those cases on board. And thereafter, there was a kind of lull. We went through the Sakura Hanami festival, and there were crowds all over the place. And then suddenly you have a spike in Japan, and there are additional measures that are being taken even as we speak. But overall, I would say that Japan has done rather well in standing up to this great pandemic. And I think partly that comes from Japan's extremely high standards of sanitation and discipline and consensus within the domestic constituencies as well. As collateral damage, we have seen two standouts really. One is the postponement of the, unfortunately, the postponement of the Olympics to next year, and the other, postponement seems to be that of the much-awaited visit of President Xi Jinping to Tokyo as part of that growing rapprochement that is very much in evidence over the last few years, as both countries come out of that tailspin in which bilateral relations had kind of been seen over the last several years, that is to say between Japan and China. Now, there's no doubt that the US-China trade war has been disruptive, and we have seen also that never before have all others been so intrinsically linked to the both of them. So that makes for very difficult choices for all the others that have very strong, relationship with both the United States and China. And I would imagine that Japan squarely falls in that category. It has deep-rooted trade and economic links with China as well. It has this long festering territorial dispute in the Senkakus, and it therefore compounds some of the difficulties that Japan faces in this context, when we find that the United States and China are also engaged in another kind of contestation about the politics of the virus, the origins of the virus, and the demands for accountability and transparency. So overall, it's very clear that global opinion is weighted against China, but the jury is still out, and there is much disputation. Multilateralism has clearly fallen by the wayside, and the Indo-Pacific especially is something that seems to be quite active in terms of what's happening in that theater. The COVID has not really put the Chinese out. In other words, despite COVID, we see there is a fair bit of activity on the part of China in the Indo-Pacific region. There are several incidents that I could cite, but I don't want to go into details, vis-a-vis Japan, vis-a-vis Vietnam, vis-a-vis the United States, taking place in terms of maritime events and incidents. And now the ASEAN seems to be rather dependent on China for its own prosperity and security. The US has come up with new programs such as the Build Act, ARIA, and Asia Edge against all the inducements that were being offered by China. Japan and China have also joined hands with the United States in the context of the Blue Dot Network and the Indo-Pacific Business Forum. So there is a fair bit that's going on there. What is interesting is that the Quad countries, and especially in the context of Quad Plus, seem to be now reaching out to others as well for a dialogue, even on the agreed upon issues. So we have seen of late the fact that Quad Plus has engaged New Zealand, Vietnam, and South Korea. On another occasion, Quad Plus has also engaged Brazil and South Korea and Israel. So a Quad Plus in dialogue format, whether at the level of the ministers or at the next level, is very much in evidence. In the maritime sphere, we have also seen that the Quad is exercising in a Quad Plus format. we had the quad format of a different kind when India, India, Japan, the United States, and the Philippines exercised once. And on another occasion, it was the United States, Japan, Australia, and Vietnam that exercised. So in short, there is flux there as well. Now, we need to see what kind of further convergence can be built between all the countries in the region. I, for one, think this engagement in a quad or quad plus format, whether it's maritime exercises or dialogue, needs to be taken all the way to the east coast of Africa. Last point, and I will end there. Japan has set aside US dollars 2.2 billion for helping Japanese companies relocate. In other words, not to put all eggs in one basket. And it's a question of helping Japanese companies to shift manufacturing and supply chains out of China, should they wish to do so. But a full 2 billion has obviously been reserved for helping these companies to move back to Japan, which may be difficult in itself, given the higher cost of production in Japan and logistics, etc. But only $200 million has been set aside to help Japanese companies relocate to other parts of Asia. In the context of RCEP, there is evidently a natural proclivity for Japanese companies to prefer, for instance, Vietnam or something else in Southeast Asia as a destination. India is not part of RCEP, and I wonder if panelists will also reflect on whether that comes in the way of Japanese companies, making a beeline for India. We are doing well on investments from Japan. And generally, for the last couple of years, they have been just a tad under $3 billion, which is a very welcome and substantial sum. With these few words, once again, a very warm welcome to all our participants. Our first speaker this evening is Jun Isomura, Senior Fellow, Hudson Institute, Washington, D.C. May I request you to use about 13 to 15 minutes? And he will speak on alliance politics and Japan's security outlook post-COVID-19. The floor is yours. Jun Isomura.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm Jun Isomura, Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute at Washington, D.C. Another expert will talk more deeply on the details issues, so I would like to focus on the outlook of security and alliance politics with a little bit longer term. Pandemic, the post the pandemic 19, but we don't know when the situation will over. All countries face the same subject as the corona pandemic today, and they are fighting with it in their own way and trading on eggs. There is not correct solution yet, just under experiment, since there are not any medicines for treatment and vaccine yet. And I think people are a bit of panic order. We have to seek that sustainable way to live with the virus, because it will be impossible surely to beat them. There is such an observation that growing discussion about economic decoupling, entangling and diversifying away from China to ensure a more self-reliance and resilient. And another growing consideration is about democracy and authoritarianism. Pessimistically, there are concerns about the collapse of democracy and authoritarianism to get more robust with this pandemic. However, positively, the history of democracy has been cultured and defined with several crises. And this time will be an essential opportunity to develop more mature democracy as a resilient and wholesome system. And I believe so. The next discussion is about international cooperation and fragmentation. The other word is confrontation. COVID-19 makes bipole between the US and China. With the pandemic, the vulnerability of the US industries occurred clearly. It depends on China too much. And the American exploded their dissatisfaction and irritation toward China. However, it is not only Americans, even European countries, especially Germany, France, and the UK, are raising their alert to China. One of the topics is Der Spiegel, the top quality German magazine, published an article which cited intelligence from the German's Federal Intelligence Service, Bundesnachrichtendienst, on that the Chinese leader Xi Jinping asked WHO Director General Tedros to hold back information about human-to-human transmission and to delay a pandemic warning by their telephone conversation on January 21st. The BND estimates that China's information policy lost 4 to 6 weeks to fight the virus worldwide. The BND is the intelligence service body under the direct order of the Federal Chancellery. The information has shared in the Western intelligence community in secret, but not opened. The article of Der Spiegel should be an intention by German Chancellor Merkel, a sort of warning to China. BBC also wrote a report titled China's New Army of Tough-Talking Diplomat at the Wolf-Warry Diplomacy. China is now quite aggressive politically and militarily at both East and South China Seas. There is a big vacuum in those areas since expanding COVID-19 in the US Navy, including the US 7th Fleet carrier in Japan. Also, US withdrew the bombers from Guam, including B-1B, B-52, and B-2. It is harming the US forward deterrent in the Pacific. I would like to introduce my colleague, Seth Grepsy, comment. He is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute and expert in the US Navy. And he said that the regional situation is changing. He is very concerned about what China is doing. And he is worried about the US Navy's ability to recover quickly enough if China decided to take military action. He doesn't think that China's current aggressiveness is not only a military exercise. They are waiting to see how the countries in the region and the US will react. Then they will decide what to do. So he said. However, Beijing will also get irreparable damage politically and economically with the pandemic and their aggressiveness. John Lee, a senior fellow of our institute and also my colleague, mentioned in his article that the most disruptive battleground will be in the enabling technology sectors, neatly captured in Beijing's Made in China 2025 blueprint. He also wrote the US should increasingly develop approaches to deny or restrict Chinese firms access to capital markets and know-how in MIC sectors. I think Xi Jinping might face a dire situation, including possibility of collapse of Chinese Communist Party regime. The Chinese economy will be damaged severely after the COVID-19, and One Belt, One Road initiative can be a ruined asset, the same as ancient Silk Road. Their aggressiveness today might hide their vulnerability from sight with a cover to outside and even inside their country. The Sinocentrism will be just their dream. Regarding DPRK, North Korea, it looks Washington and Pyongyang will reach a certain point of an agreement after the COVID-19. Therefore, I think DPRK will not be a substantial threat to us. And finally, I have to refer to the Indo-Pacific, India-Japan alliance. We have long history of relations since 14th century. The epoch-making event was visited by Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi to Japan in November 1985. His essential purpose of his visit was to display a new India. With his visit, the view of Japanese in India changed dramatically. Today, Prime Minister Modi and Abe have trusted relations for sharing common interest, and they are major partners for the security of Indo-Pacific region. Politically, one of the important current issues is to work together for reforming the WHO, including Taiwan issue. Quite frankly speaking, even two leaders have good relations, but our economy or business development face still several difficulties in India. India also has blueprint of Make in India since 2014. However, there are several walls as bureaucracy or languages in India, and the historical and the social difficulties for Japanese companies and our alliance friends. There is also quite complicated offset regulations, especially for the defense industry, so-called defense procurement procedure 2016 with 459 pages policy document. All Western defense industry are shrunk to develop and cooperate in India. To be a real alliance, we have to find some solution to those problems. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Jun Isomura, for your very perceptive remarks. You've actually favored us with 2 extra minutes, which we will add on to other speakers if they should exceed their time. I agree with some of the points that you have made about the potential rise of authoritarianism. And also, you very rightly pointed out the overdependence that the United States and Europe, for that matter, even Japan, have had in terms of economic linkages with China. And that, in the views of some observers, is tantamount to actually reducing the range of options that you have at your disposal. On the other hand, you also made a valid point that having difficulties in political relations does not necessarily mean that you cannot have good economic relations. And on the converse, having very good political relations, as is the case between India and Japan, does not necessarily automatically translate into excellent economic ties. You pointed out some of the difficulties that Japanese companies face in terms of their investment plans in India, and I can assure you that the government of India is doing everything possible to ensure that these concerns are addressed. As far as the defense procurement procedures are concerned, there is a DPP 2020 draft document that has been put out for public comment right now, and I'm sure we will welcome the views of Japanese experts as well in terms of how we can fine-tune this potential for the defense sector to get more Japanese companies to come and participate. But let me also tell you that the Japanese companies are rather reluctant to step out of their comfort zone. When you look at all the Japanese companies together, barely 4 to 5% of their production is meant for exports, defense exports. 95% is consumed. Whatever Mitsubishi and Kawasaki will make is consumed by the Japanese self-defense forces. So given that there is hardly any reliance on the export market, they are not particularly active in this field. They prefer G2G contracts. They are generally loath and reluctant to get into the hurly-burly of tendering and stuff like that, which is really the big game today. India is one of the largest buyers, and just about everybody is there in the market. We want Japan to be there as well. So whenever you can, please encourage Japanese companies to participate in tenders that are put out by countries like India. There's commercial benefit there. And there is not a single Indian company that is today on the list of entities that are proscribed as far as Japan is concerned. So there's no reason why Japan or Japanese companies should be reluctant to step forth the way the US companies or Israeli companies or European companies come to India, particularly in the defense sector. I now move on to my next speaker here, which is Mr. Tosh Minohara, Professor, Kobe University, and Chairman, Research Institute for Indo-Pacific in Japan. He will speak to us on Sino-US relations in the post-corona world and how Japan should prepare. The floor is yours. 15 minutes, please. Mr. Minohara, you may please unmute your mic. Yes, you've done that now. I can see that you clicked that, and you will now be audible. Go ahead, please. I still can't hear you. Your mic is muted. If your mic is muted, we cannot hear you. Yes, it seems unmuted now.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
Of course. Roger,
excellent.
Go ahead.
Great. I'm going to jump right in. I don't know if you guys have my handout. I have a 3-page handout. Is that in front of you guys?
All right. It's been received. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So, greetings from Kobe. Pleasure to be here. Well, I just want to sort of lay out my basic understanding of what's going on in the world. I think that, COVID itself is a very dangerous disease, but yet I still worry about the international relations post-COVID. Now, we all know that Chinese ambitions and aspirations are ambivalent now. We don't talk about the peaceful rise anymore. That's no longer, people don't talk about that. China has become a great power. It knows that it has become a great power. And so now I think it's the phase in which it will act like a great power. Now, in my definition, there are several definitions of what a great power is, but one I think is critically important is that great power can redefine the rules in a way that enhances its national interests. And we see that with the United States. The United States, look at American history, free trade was not part of its rules, but post-war, it felt that this would benefit it, so it decided to change the rules, on and on and on. I think the COVID-19 has created a splendid opportunity for China, since the United States has not only failed to lead a considerable response, but it's also failed in safeguarding its own people. And so there are a lot of comparisons in the United States, including President Trump, how it's Pearl Harbor. I think the analogy is not really a false analogy, and the fact that in 1941, the Americans knew the Japanese were going to strike. They didn't know where they were going to strike, but it was coming. Yet the Americans remained unprepared, and I think it's the same with COVID. It was just a matter of time that COVID was going to strike the United States, but the United States, in the end, did not make the appropriate preparations. I think China does not intend on creating a new Sino-centric. It's the next page. Does not intend on creating a new Sino-centric world order, a Pax Sinica. Rather, it wants a free hand in its sphere of control, and therefore, I see this G2 scenario. Unfortunately, Japan belongs in this sphere. For China, if it wants to go out, extend out to the Pacific, Japan definitely gets in the way. I think to a lesser degree, so does India. India also definitely is part of China's sphere, although most likely China sees India as perhaps a more formidable obstacle. Now, let's go to the United States. Because of its mishandling of its response to the COVID crisis, and it's an election year, and Trump, above all, hates to lose. And he does not want to lose in the upcoming election. So he needs a scapegoat. Of course, Obama is a convenient scapegoat, and so are the Democrats. But the best one that he has right now is, of course, China. And so I think he will portray China as an American nemesis to the United States, and it's a card that he'll try to use. And I guess initially you'll see these struggles take place within international institutions in general. For example, the United Nations Security Council, WHO, which started today, and I guess Xi Jinping gave a speech, which was, I think, really reflects China taking an initiative. This is not an international institution, but the vaccine race definitely has connotations of the United States and its allies versus China. And this will further exacerbate tensions as the United States seeks concrete results. And the results are that the Chinese backing down. But of course, China cannot back down that easily as well, because it too plays a two-level game. Xi Jinping cannot be a weak dictator by definition, and therefore he's going to stand up for what he believes China's rights. United States will increase pressure on Huawei and other Chinese corporations. So I think phase one may very well falter as a result of Chinese lessening. But you can also see that China is also lessening dependence on the United States. There's an interesting article in the Nikkei the other day, and it sort of took apart the latest Chinese cell phone by Huawei and compared it with a similar model last year. And the components, the parts that are used to be heavily United States. Now it's down to 1%. And so I thought the article was fascinating in that it showed how in just the span of 1 year, Chinese are rushing to lessen their technological dependence on the United States. Now, I've because of COVID, we're all attending these webinars, and I've had the opportunity to participate in several in the United States. And what you get, and also talking to my friends and my colleagues in the United States, you can't deny that the tide of U.S. public opinion has really turned in favor of a strong stance positioning towards China. I don't want to use the word anti-China, but that's definitely what it is. It's very, very strong. And this is also truly bipartisan. As a politician, I don't see how you can win on a platform of being pro-China. So things have definitely changed, and this is not a very positive, I believe, setting for international relations as well. There's going to be a showdown. Now, next slide, please. How Japan needs to prepare. I call this, because we are in the era of Reiwa now, the Reiwa restoration. But of course, here we're not restoring the emperor. And I'll sort of get into what Japan needs to restore. Now, with COVID, social distancing is now the norm. And henceforth, we're not hanging out with our friends anymore. We're doing this web stuff. But post-COVID, I think nation distancing, especially with China, will become a key word. And that is, especially for Japan, it needs to reduce its economic reliance on China, to reduce its exposure. This means decoupling of people and goods to counter Chinese leverage. This is easier said than done because Chinese tourists are in a very important market in Japan and whatnot. How do you make up for this loss of people, loss of products, loss of markets? It's very difficult, but you have to do this if you want to want to position yourself in a better place vis-a-vis China. The advantage that China has, I call it FIFO, first in, first out. It was first to suffer from the COVID, so it's the first to pull out, and therefore its economy will presumably be better, will recover quicker than other nations. And therefore, it can entice other countries by saying, hey, our market's open, sell us your goods, and whatnot. And China started doing that with its medical diplomacy, sending out masks, sometimes defective, and whatnot. And so, and this could be a really, really sweet piece of pie that Japan may go for. Because, hey, if people are losing their jobs and the economy is tanking, then what do? These are hard options that leaders in Japan have to make. I believe it's a choice that Japan should avoid, however. We also need to ensure that economic blocks do not emerge. We don't want to repeat a 1930s-like situation. So definitely Japan needs to work more to support free trade. That is CTPP, Japan, EU, and Japan, UK free trade agreements need to be expanded and enlarged. Perhaps the process needs to be hastened. Now there's a rigid schedule. Perhaps it's important that we sort of expedite some of these, when these tariffs go down. I think Japan also needs to bolster naval presence in the Senkakus. And these things aren't cheap. This will necessitate an increase in defense spending. And of course, we all know that the Japanese Air Force is now scrambling on a daily basis because the Chinese are threatening Japanese airspace. They're sending in their ships to the Senkakus on a daily basis. And they're now chasing Japanese fishing boats. And how audacious is this? So in a way, I think most Japanese understand that China is not a real friend. I believe that Japan, and this is critically important, that Japan needs to ensure that the United States remains engaged in the region. And this is not a given. In the past, America, in the early part of the 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt cut off Korea, even though there was an alliance with Korea in protecting Korea. Americans cut off South Vietnam when South Vietnam wasn't pulling its weight. And so and the Americans could always go back to Guam. That's that they can pull to that line if they needed to. So Japan needs to make sure it doesn't do that. And this also probably means more money, increasing host nation support. But money probably will only go so far, but Japan needs to do more action-wise, right? FDEMA relocation is going nowhere, and I guess a good example for Japan is to see where ROK goes. Will the Americans still remain, keep their military presence in ROK, or if Moon Jae-in takes the jump over to the other side, will the Americans cut ROK loose? These are things that Japan needs to observe very closely. I believe that Japan needs to link more closely with Europe, especially Britain and France, and get more involved in NATO. It's an observer, but there's a lot more that Japan can do to engage European countries to make sure that there is, and of course, if the United States pulls out, European countries won't be able to make up for that. But yet, it's good to have layers, I believe, in your security. And of course, defining a very clear FOIP strategy. Stop calling it a concept. It has to be more than a concept. And sharpening Quad. Quad is sort of fuzzy, but I think we need to put more teeth into it, more meat and then some more teeth into it. Australia is now, Australia tends to straddle the fence from Prime Minister. Right now, Australia is very aggressive after China. And I know there was a spat between Australia and India, and perhaps we can get over that. We should look at the big picture. After all, Australia and India share lots of common values, and therefore, perhaps it's time that we really redefine this Quad. Supporting maritime ASEAN is important. Don't kid yourself. ASEAN is not a monolithic bloc. The ASEAN countries that are not landlocked, that have an ocean, fear China. And among those, Vietnam, Indonesia is critically important because of its mass. And these are countries that Japan needs to link up more. ASEAN hates it when you try to go and divide it, but there are various shades of colors in ASEAN, and some are more pro-China, more red than others. And I think it's a reality, and I think we need to take advantage of these realities. In the long term, what Japan needs to do, and this is within the decade, hopefully it'll be sooner, is of course revising Article 9. And when I speak to my Japanese colleagues here who say that no, just reinterpretation of national security laws is plenty, but revising these national security related laws does not really alter the Japanese mindset. the Japanese people don't understand. I think it's the Constitution that really defines who you are as a nation and as a people. And therefore, I think reprising Article 9 is critically important. And that also ties into what I just said, having the United States engaged in the region. This means Japan can do more. It's committed to do more. And therefore, the United States has a reason to be by Japan's side. Now, going to the restoring part, I think it's time that Japan restores its security identity. You know, the world has changed, you know, and so people don't, except for Korea maybe, don't point the finger at Japan and say, hey, you invaded, you got to say sorry. It's a different world now, right? Japan needs to understand that it needs to participate in contributing to the security of the region. I'm not saying in Japan should send troops in the Middle East or anything like that, but at least in your own neighborhood, in your own backyard, Japan needs to play a greater role. And this is something that the Korean Constitution does not allow. And I'm going to take it a step further. I think Japan needs to defend Taiwan. You know, and this is something that Japan cannot do under the Korean Constitution. But this is Japan's colonial legacy. You know, this is Japan's responsibility. Taiwan is a full-fledged democracy. You know, and what happens if China makes this aggressive move, takes Taiwan? It changes Japan's security reality, you know, to its detriment. So better go out there and help secure Taiwan before Taiwan is lost. And of course, right now, Japan can't do that. So this is the restoration, this restoring the sense that you are a normal country and that you will do things to protect your national interests. And that can also mean force projection. Okay, and finally, my final slide. So the coming clash. I tend to be pessimistic. I think hegemonic challenge, and this is a hegemonic challenge. It's not a hegemonic shift because we don't know if you know China will take over the United States, but it is a challenge. You know, just like we saw in the 1930s. And you know, it doesn't take Graham Allison to figure out that the world gets very unstable. Even in Japanese domestic history, after a strong government collapses, then it's a period of warring states. And we talk about, you know, we make this analogy with the Cold War, but you got to remember, at least in Asia, the Cold War was not all cold. You know, the Korean War was definitely hot. So when we talk about this Cold War analogy, we got to keep in mind that there can be instances where the militaries could collide. And there's also a whole bunch of proxy wars, not to mention. Now, from the American perspective, acquiescing to Chinese dominance is not a viable policy option, right? It just, no politician will be able to do that. You can't kowtow to China. Now, I also, you know, study American policy, American history. And I think it's part of American national DNA to defy the traditional cycle of history, that America, the founding forefathers, created a nation upon a hill in which there will be no decline, right? At least that's what they're aspiring to do. And therefore, it will always step up to the challenge. It might be late stepping up to the challenge, but it will. And it will try to pretty much neuter this threat. You saw this with the United Kingdom. America did not allow Britain to reestablish its colonies post-World War II. Axis powers, you know, America stood up. Soviet Union, Japan in the 1980s, right? It was a threat. The rising sun. It was all the rage. You know, Japan was going to take over America. It never happened. And now it's China. And so what's going to happen is, and you start to see this already when you go to attend these conferences, is that Americans will have the us and them mentality, okay? And China will be vilified, and it will be labeled the next evil empire, right? And the American people will support this view. And that's all creates for a very, very unstable international environment. What may happen in the short term is, you remember CHINCOM? Was that 1957 when it was dissolved, became COCOM? Now it's the Wassenaar arrangement of multilateral export control regimes. I think you're going to see a strengthening of the Wassenaar arrangement. The Americans will be forcing the hands of its allies not to trade with China and whatnot. All right, so and of course, them in this case will probably China, Russia, and Iran, the 21st century tripartite pact. So these are things that I worry about. What's interesting is that in that Nikkei article, the Nikkei made a big point about how China was lessening its dependence on American technology. But what increased, of course, the Chinese component in this high-tech Chinese phone has increased, but its reliance on Korean parts and Japanese parts has also increased. So if that's cut out, if the Japanese Korean technology is cut out, then I think China will struggle to make up for that shortfall. Now, geographic clashing points, of course, Hong Kong, we used to, before COVID, it was Hong Kong, and now Hong Kong's out of the picture. But sorry, this is going to be Sudetenland. It's no nation will act to defend Hong Kong's liberty. So I think it's just a matter of time. I think the Chinese know that. They just want to play their hand really well. Taiwan, on the other hand, I believe will be Poland. Even though there are people in the United States and my friends and some friends from Australia will say, no, we're not, the world will not protect Taiwan. But I think nations will be forced to take sides in that. Now, in the event that Japan does not play a prominent role in the defense of Taiwan, decides to stay behind the scenes, then I think the world won't forget, or the free world won't forget Japan's lack of action. Now, Senkaku is a little bit trickier. I think it lies in the middle. It's not an automatic casus belli per se, but perhaps will lead in some kind of strong economic sanctions. But once these islands are taken, it's going to be a lot of work getting them back. So if I were Japan, I would really create some kind of plan as to seriously defend these islands. I mean, right now you have goats on these islands, and the goats, as far as I know, don't do a great job defending islands. Finally, so this is me talking about the Cold War was not cold in East Asia, the proxy wars. What I think is going to happen is I think we're going to go to the brink. We saw that in the Cold War with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then you had detente. In the 1980s, you had Reagan. You had, you came really close again between the Soviet Union and the United States. Then you had sort of thawing and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. So I think we'll see this coming and going to the brink. But if there are miscalculations, then what happens is you stumble to war. You see that World War I and World War II. So my picture, at 5 years down, 10 years down, I mean, I don't really have a rosy picture. As human beings, we're flawed. We're flawed. Animals, Homo sapiens are completely flawed, and I don't think we've truly learned from our past mistakes. So that's where I put it. And finally, China will take advantage of perceived weakness and division among democracies. So if we squabble amongst ourselves, Chinese will love that. And therefore, we need to overcome our instincts of primate der nation, right? Globalization, people say is out the window because of COVID. We got to fight that instinct. We got to bring together the coalition of like-minded powers. This is the only way we could actually preserve democracy, and of course, democracy is not a given. Thank you, Chair. Sorry for going over time.
Thank you. Okay. No, that's all right. Thank you, Mr. Minohara. That was a very interesting presentation, and of course, you also left us with many, sort of contradictory dilemmas in our minds, because you referred to China as a great power, and you said it's acting like one. But I think one of the key definitions of a great power is one that accepts responsibility, the one that actually accepts accountability. And today in this fractured world, the only phenomenon that we are going to see consistently is great power being whittled away in favor of states and non-states actors that are sharing that power. It's very difficult in this age today, in a world which is fractured, where power is fractured, for any power to become great again so soon. So I think there are a number of planks on which there is great equalization by states and non-states actors, and technology and trade are part of that process. I was intrigued by what you said about Japan not coming to Taiwan's assistance if push came to shove, and then ruining the fact. I think you'll have to keep that in mind in Japan as well, because the fact is that the next few years are going to be sensitive. It's not just the 100th anniversary of the CPC that's coming up in 2021, but there is also the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PLA that's coming up in 2027. And with Xi Jinping already around for much longer than most had bargained for, it's very likely that there could be greater tensions in the years immediately leading up to 2027. And if Japan were to keep out of the fray, it's very much a moot question if anybody else would then come to Japan's assistance. Japan, of course, has been wise in not referring anymore to free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. The word strategy was dropped a couple of years ago as soon as the sort of rapprochement was taking place around the two great anniversaries, the 40th and the 45th anniversaries. Quietly, the word strategy was dropped. That doesn't mean that Japan doesn't have a strategy. I think Japan is a very mature country which will always have strategies. The last point I would make on your very interesting presentation is that you advocated and called for much greater global outlook on the part of Japan. But the point is that there was a study recently which showed that the Japanese people are hardly interested in traveling abroad. And most certainly the youth is not interested in traveling or studying abroad. So you will have a contradiction between what is expected of Japan as a great economic power and one with great strategic potential, I should say, and the requirements of the people and how they look at a world around them. So whether it's going to be a continental mentality of the type that the Chinese have, or an island mentality that is often seen in certain parts of the world, much will depend on that. I will now move on to our third speaker, Mr. Tsuneo Watanabe, Senior Fellow of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Tokyo. And before I hand over the, request him to take the floor, I just want to say hello to my good friend and colleague, Mr. Raj Srivastav, Deputy Chief of Mission from our embassy in Tokyo, a dear colleague with which with whom I had the pleasure to spend some time in Tokyo during my term there. So welcome, Raj. And listen, if you want to chip in with some, comments of your own, you're more than welcome to do so. All right. So feel free by letting me know through the chat box. Over to you, Mr. Watanabe. Please take your 14 to 15 minutes. If you can stay within that, it'd be nice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
All right. Yes, loud and clear. Go ahead.
All right, good. And Mr. Chinoy, it's good to see you since you left Tokyo. So it's a great pleasure, and I appreciate your service in Tokyo. And I'm sure that you and your colleague must miss very good cherry blossom in your residence and your embassy. So it was a good one. So, but anyway, let me go to the Japan's COVID-19 policy and the security policy. That's probably kind of related because
and your topic, Mr. Watanabe, is also, as you said, the US-China conflict. So penny for your thoughts on that. Thank you.
COVID-19 and US-China conflict and security issues. That's very kind of a similarity. I think, no, Ambassador, you mentioned Japan has a strategy. Yes, but Japan's strategy is not so well known or very visible, very vague, not clearly stated. That is the case. And Japan's policy toward the COVID-19 is like this. I think Japan is taking a very unorthodox approach to prevent COVID-19 because Japan didn't have a very good capacity of intensive care. So Japan didn't conduct a PCR test widely. Instead, focusing on tracing the patients and I think find out the cluster and try to isolate them. Actually, now the U.S. is trying to do this kind of things. I think the strategy as the transit to the exit. Well, anyway, Japan's policy was not so well understood and sometimes criticized. Big gamble. And but it seems to me Japan is successful so far. Relatively small death people, 744 out of 60,285 infectors. So of course, the still exit strategies are not so easy. However, at least Japan is successfully to stay without heavier infection or without heavy loss of the function of a state. So that is a kind of asset for Japan to manage a very difficult situation, especially the US-China conflict is ongoing. So I think probably I'd like to talk about Japan's kind of strategy or policy toward the post-COVID-19 world and in security situation. That kind of approach. Probably it's a part of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific initiative. Now Japan called the initiative. Well, I think this kind of things is two pillars. That's my interpretation. One pillar is realism. Realism is a balance of power. What kind of balance power? That's maintain current balance of power in the region and deter China's assertive or aggressive action. So for that maintenance, Japan's alliance with the United States and the interoperability with the US military is very important. But the other pillar was liberalism. What is liberalism? That's maintain the current regional order and especially the trade, finance, and many areas, and try to maintain stability in the region with like-minded countries. Who is a like-minded country? That's Ambassador Chinoy you mentioned. First one is the very important one is the Quad, and also plus Quad plus. I think you mentioned several countries. I think as ASEAN country and ROK, South Korea, or many countries. But that's very important for Japan to maintain the regional stability as a public goods. And of course, US is a very important part. However, it seems me US is now in trouble. President Trump is not so interested in such kind of vague, it's not vague, but for Mr. Trump, it's kind of a faraway argument and very liberal argument. That's not in his dictionary. But good news is that Mr. Trump is interested in dealing with China and try to maximize his own interests. I think that's not so bad things for the region. But of course, we have to be very careful. Too much conflict between United States and China. So kind of hedge is maintaining liberalism. That is making a space for all like-minded nations to participate in such kind of sphere of wealth or prosperity or stability. I think Japan is now trying to such a difficult game, and current situation is, by the way, really bad, not so good. On April 13th, our defense minister Kono criticized China. China continues to assert military action even in the coronavirus crisis. I think that was a really the strong words because China continued to send vessels surrounding Senkaku Islands under Japan's administrative control, and also send Chinese military planes near air control zone. And Japan really need to send military scramble jet fighters. And also Chinese naval activities are also very active, not only in East China Sea, but South China Sea. So very impressive incident is Chinese aircraft carrier, Liaoning. The battle group has sailed near Taiwan after passing through the Miyako Strait in Japan on April 11, and went back from Taiwan, surrounding Taiwan to the 28th. And the last passage of aircraft carrier group was June 2019, last year. So how come China have to do? Of course, that's several explanations. China really need to show strength, but also it's a testing strength of alliance, U.S. alliance, U.S. allied partner. Because as you may realize, the 3 U.S. aircraft carrier is suffering from cruise infection of COVID-19. So it's the opportunity to test how strong or how weak. And one good news is Japan's self-defense forces passed the examination to protect their own force from COVID-19. No serious infection. And actually, they conducted several supporting the operation to the Crown Princess cruise ship in Japan, and self-defense forces helped them, and no infection was found in their own crew, the members of self-defense forces. And also, self-defense forces proved that their own hospital was a perfectly avoided infection, unlike other civilian hospitals in Tokyo. So I think the self-defense forces has done several good collaboration and cooperation with the U.S. naval ship. For example, the April 2nd, Japan self-defense forces destroyer, Teruzuki, that's DD-116, and U.S. littoral combat ship, Gabriel Gifford, that's LCS-10, conducted operations together in the Andaman Sea, that's near Indian Ocean. And also April 9 to 11, Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces destroyer Akebono, that's DD-108, and U.S. amphibious assault ship, USS America, with 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit in Okinawa, had a bilateral communication exercise in Philippine Sea and East China Sea during April 9 to April 11. I think that is a clearly message to China. Especially the latter exercises are targeting for the some assertive action against the islands, Japan's territory. So clearly amphibious capability with Japan and the US military is clearly the sign asking China not to go further. And that was a kind of a success, I believe. That's really realism side, balance of power. What is the liberal side? Japan's defense minister Kono talked with the French counterpart, Florence Parly, that's now a female French defense minister. And Kono talked with her on April 7th and agreed to share threat perception on Chinese military's recent move with France. So I think the France is kind of also suffering from COVID-19 infection, especially the aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle. But clearly, Japan's relatively well-functioning the military capability is a kind of a combination with other parts to secure the East and the South China Sea. I think that is a very important the situation. And of course, Japan's military capability is very limited, unlike US. But also, as a facilitator, as a somehow the promoter for the regional stability, I think it's something very remarkable so far. And that's one hope for the Japan to play the major role in the future in the security, and not only security, but also regional stability. I think that's the Japan's assets for the maintaining the alliance with the United States, but also as a like-minded player. And you know, many players in the region, in the Pacific region, of course, understand the realism, understand the liberalism, but for Japan, I think India and Australia, two major players understand both liberalism and realism. That is clearly the good sign for the Japan. So in the future, of course, unfortunately, U.S. the influence or soft power may be shrinking for a while. U.S. may wake up sometimes, but it seems to me U.S. leader and the constituency are not so interested in their own soft power or their investment in the region. Of course, military experts and military understand, but ordinary people and leader don't know. And also, we never know the result of a November U.S. president election. So we really need to think about it and making hedge and making cooperation among the like-minded countries, not U.S., not China, but Japan, India, Australia, and ASEAN nation, and potentially ROK too. By the way, you mentioned ROK twice. I'm glad, Mr. Chinoy, you joined ISDA. When I was in the Tokyo Foundation, actually, I'm now Sasakawa Peace Foundation. I conducted a very interesting trilateral track 1.5 dialogue with ISDA Tokyo Foundation and South Korean Foreign Ministry's think tank. I think it's an opportunity for us to work because, in India, South Korea, Japan is a second, third, fourth largest economic power in the Asia. And also, both are very important partner of the United States. And somehow, our relation with China is not all or nothing, or do or die. We have some closer relation for the economy, and also we have a very difficult situation too. But I know anyway we cannot escape from our geopolitical location. So I think it's a very good opportunity to work. So let me finish this. So thank you very much.
I thank you, Mr. Watanabe, for actually giving us what is, to my mind, a very optimistic presentation. It was also very robust in parts, and the manner in which you made your points also suggests that Japan is not going to just be sitting back and doing nothing. Japan will do much more. But apart from hedging, the suggestion about ROK leads one to also ponder whether the difficulties in relations between the entire Korean peninsula, whether the North or the South, and Japan, the residual difficulties of a certain history of the past, wouldn't they come in the way of a much more closer cooperation between Japan and the ROK? My own visit to the ROK quite recently last year left me with that impression that the emotions involved in these ties. By the way, I went around the time when your trade spat was at its peak. So that may be a factor. So Japan will have to cast its net wide, but much more than just India and others, it'll also have to do a great deal more on its own. There is no gainsaying the fact that Japan needs to have a much more robust defense and security posture of its own. I do hope it'll get there one day. I now turn to our next speaker, our fourth speaker, and that is Mr. Yoichiro Sato, professor of the Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University, Japan, who will speak to us on FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, and Japan's maritime vision in a post-COVID period. The floor is yours. Mr. Sato, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Chinoy. And I prepared a PowerPoint slide, so if you can put it up. And I don't know how to do it here because this is my first time using this WebEx system.
We will do it for you. We will do it for you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Yeah, can you go to the second slide, please? Yes, one more page. Yes. The Ambassador, you mentioned that as a strategy, although the government officially says it's a vision, not a strategy, but Japan as a country should have a strategy, and I'm also in the same view that I keep using the word despite the government's official stance, and I think Japan does have a strategy. And when you have a strategy, you of course have to have a strategic vision. So what your environment is like, and once you assess the external environment as well as internal capability, you can start thinking about what strategy you should adopt. So how Japan sees the world is my first point, and Japan kind of a new bipolar world. Instead, Japan is seeing a multipolar world, which is coming. And, you know, Professor Minohara mentioned the kind of G2 kind of world, but it is the very thing Japan has been working so hard to prevent during the past 2 decades or so. And you can recall various the problem Japan had when President Clinton didn't stop in Tokyo and went to Beijing instead. And the Japanese called it Japan passing, and Tokyo was very upset at that. So Japan doesn't want to see another prospect of a G2 kind of global governance. And also, Japan is looking at the Indo-Pacific region as the biggest of the 3 major economic blocks in the world. One being North American bloc, the other Indo-Pacific economy is bigger. China, Japan, Korea, India, ASEAN economies are all growing fast. So this block is going to be attraction for the other 2 blocks. So if this block can act together, then it can be a strong lever for Japan in dealing with the other 2 blocks. So you can see that, you can flip to the next slide, please. Yes. Yeah, so this is like prospect in the future, so that you can see what kind of economic order we are anticipating in the coming years. You can you flip to the next one, please? Yes, so I'm kind of sorted the threat and opportunities by internal and external categories. This is a typical SWOT analysis kind of table. So Japan is looking at both internal and external threats and opportunities. But the 2 things I want to note is that credibility of the bilateral alliance with the United States is declining. 2 reasons. One is it's just a long-term trend that the relative power balance between US and China is shifting. But in the immediate term, it's Donald Trump who's doing such a big damage to the credibility of the alliance. And the second point I want to mention is that Japan sees its own limitation in pursuing either a more autonomous defense or playing a greater supplementary role to support the bilateral alliance. Either way, Japan's resources are quite limited, demographic factor, budgetary factor, and so forth. So Japan doesn't really have an option, broad options, but the alliance will remain in the most important part of Japan's strategy. But Japan is, as Mr. Watanabe mentioned, pursuing the alliance plus, so additional alignments with different partners. And I think previous speakers have all talked about the Quad members, and some people would call it the middle power alignment. And but also Japan is playing a quite active role to keep ASEAN solidarity as much as possible. You know, ASEAN is not a solid entity, and you know, people talk about China kind of dividing and conquering ASEAN by luring countries like Cambodia and Laos. But the United States is doing the exact same thing by trying to quote Vietnam, for example, ahead of other ASEAN countries. So, so this is not good for Japan. Japan wants to see ASEAN more united, and I think it's playing a very important role. And South Korea as one of the like-minded countries, which should play an important role in this. I'm not very sure. I think there was also a mention by Isomura-san about the kind of upcoming resolution of the Korean Peninsula problem between the United States and North Korea. I just cannot imagine how that might unfold, but you know, the uncertainties there means that South Korean prospect as a part of the hedging strategy for Japan is also very uncertain. So I'm not very sure about what kind of role South Korea has in this. The economic part I'd like to talk about is that Japanese economy has really transformed itself. The typical, you know, the manufacturing export-led growth is a thing of the past for Japan. Japan makes more money on investment revenue than the trade surplus. So when Trump talks about Japan's trade surplus, he's looking at the 30-year-old statistics back from the 1980s or 1990s. You know, Japan is no longer like that. And Japan is focusing more on service sector trade and investment rules than the goods trade on the bilateral scale and so forth. But having said that, Japanese companies have established factories throughout Asia, a lot of that in China, but in Southeast Asia as well. And they have built a production network. So can you move to the next slide? Okay. So the economic game and the strategic, the military power balance game are two different games which are interconnected. On the economic side, Japan is too integrated with China, so the complete decoupling, such as the one Trump is talking about, is going to hurt Japan. And Dr. Minohara is fully aware of this. He does mention that, but I think he's still speaking from the American perspective, not really paying attention to the damage to Japan and how much Japan dislikes this kind of US approach. So for Japan, you know, as Japan did, pursuing TPP and RCEP concurrently, had a very good reason, strategic reason to move both negotiations to Japan's favor. And it's not going well, unfortunately, right now, because India decided to pull out of RCEP, and Trump, you know, already pulled out of TPP, and and acting really selfishly to bring the US back into the kind of concessions Japan made without giving away the concession US made during the TPP negotiation. So Japan's strategy was there, but it's not working so well so far. There was a last point, there was a mention about the Abe government's subsidy for encouraging Japanese companies to divest from Japan. I mean, excuse me, divest from China. Many companies are already saying that we just can't move out of China. And I think the Chinese economy is so large and the domestic market attraction is very strong. And for some companies in the labor-intensive sector, such subsidies would be useful if they can just use it to move the factories from China to Myanmar or to Vietnam or Cambodia, because labor cost in China has become too high. So those companies would benefit, but I don't see that many of the Japanese companies producing a little more sophisticated technological products would want to leave China. I think they would stay in China rather than taking this subsidy and coming back to Japan, which doesn't really make their businesses more competitive. So I think I'll stop here, and maybe you can have more time for Q&A.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Sato. The last 2 points that you made are very interesting. One is that the companies may actually decide to stay on. So it's one thing to say that you put aside $2.2 billion to get people to decouple from China, but these are commercial decisions. At the end of the day, it's the companies that will look at their ledgers and balance sheets and decide what is more profitable. If it's not profitable to go out of China, they will not go. So they really can't be forced, and we must keep that in mind. The other point is about ASEAN, and ASEAN not being a monolithic structure, but it's also an ASEAN that we have said is central to the whole concept of the Indo-Pacific. ASEAN centrality is something that the Quad also agrees upon. But that's also the very same feature, the centrality of the ASEAN, that enables China to be a little more reassured, given its own sway, both economic, political, and to some extent even security sway over that region. So the Chinese would, to my mind, adopt a wait-and-see attitude once everybody else is talking about ASEAN centrality, because that's one part of the field which they know how to play well in terms of influencing outcomes, whether it's the code of conduct or other things. Nobody else is involved in the code of conduct except from the outside. It's China and the ASEAN. I will now move quickly over to the Q&A, much awaited Q&A session. I will request all panelists to kindly have a peek at their chat boxes. You can see the very large number of questions. All panelists will be requested to, by turn, reflect on whatever they wish to pick out of this. I will quickly try to summarize, if at all that is possible, given the large number of questions. General Dipankar Banerjee basically is referring to Chinese assertiveness and aggressiveness, and the fact that recently they have brought about some administrative changes for the Spratlys and the Paracels, proclamations, etc. They've also been pretty aggressive in terms of their island building strategy. So what kind of a response can be generated short of war by countries like Japan, India, South Korea acting in tandem? I mean, that's the broad thrust of his three different assertions here, questions. Dr. Titli Basu from our institute wants to have your views on how Japan views 5G and technology, especially next generation networks and innovation to achieve that technological leap. Also, how Japan will act as chairman of the WHO's executive board, as, since the outbreak of COVID-19. There are a few comments here. China has an aging population and a low birth rate. Therefore, time is not on their side. And by the way, this could be applicable to many countries, and some might say even Japan has, in fact, a bigger problem on having an aging population. There is a question from Ambassador Suresh Goel. He also refers to the growing Chinese aggressiveness, wants to know what should be the strategic approach of India, Japan, and the ROK. Has the time come for a coalition of interests, if not action? And should Indonesia be included? It has so far been, in his view, ambivalent in terms of approach to China. We then have a question on what do you think? Is this some kind of COVID-19 crisis leading up to the Thucydides trap? So again, a point for reflection, because we've seen the US and China getting into a more acerbic war of words on the origins. So whether that is really leading up to the Thucydides trap. What may be China's strategic objectives in becoming aggressive currently after coming out of the COVID-19 crisis? That's Ambassador Yogendra Kumar asking that question. Well, I think generally speaking, that's the broad thrust of these points made here. So the floor is yours. Let me go first to Mr. Jun Isomura. Your thoughts, please. And please limit yourself to a few minutes. We've actually run out of time, but we do have some additional time at our disposal in reserve. So I would say like perhaps 4 to 5 minutes each speaker. Mr. Isomura, please.
Yeah, thank you. Banerjee, Major General, his question I think I can answer. The most concerned issue in Washington D.C. is on Taiwan, and China is quite aggressive to Taiwan, and if PLA attack to Taiwan, so U.S. used the Japanese base against the PLA to China. I mean, against China. So Taiwan issue is not separate from Japan. Taiwan is quite close to Japan. So and we have to tell to China that if they took such action, so their economy will severely damaged. So that such kind of we have to tell to Beijing, and also the important thing is Indo-Pacific region. I think we have to support ASEAN group. It is very important because of the getting more strong tie of ASEAN countries, 10 countries, and cooperate together, and the sort of sandwich between India and Japan, and support them. That would be very important. That is all I want to tell. Thank you.
Thank you, Isomura-san. I now move to Minohara-san, please. The floor is yours.
Okay, keep it really short. I like the comment about Japan kicking the can down the road. I think when you look at Japanese history, Japan seldom acts proactively. It always reacts. I think COVID is a good example of that, Japan reacting. I mean, it could have acted sooner. It could have shut out the Chinese visitors, but it didn't. So, yes, I think that's just part of what Japan does. It seems like I'm the most perhaps the pessimist in this group, but I like to. I think if you look back at history, history teaches us a lot. When I was a lowly graduate student, quarter century ago, 25 years ago, I mean, I was saying that China will be the next threat, and of course, everybody laughed at me. They're like, "What are you talking about? China's going to be our buddy." But it didn't happen. And to me, it was fairly obvious. I also said, as a lowly graduate student, that India will be a key player. Japan needs to link up with India. And of course, India 25 years ago, nobody took seriously. So I think the big question that we need to talk about, and that we haven't talked about, unfortunately, is how is India going to step up to the plate, right? There are a lot of worrying signs. I mean, I think democracy is not as stable in India as we'd like to presume. But what role will India play? Will India also play a role where it seeks its interests for the good of the whole? Will it support democracy and whatnot? So these are, I think, key questions which will perhaps define the latter half of the century, if not earlier. That being said, I think I'm not advocating for war, and I know there are generals in this audience and whatnot, but I just look at human history, and we've stumbled to war. Now, it's not that we all want this total war, but miscalculations lead to war, and I envision a international situation in which things will get kind of dicey. So we have to play our cards very, very carefully. Now, about Japan decoupling with China, like I said, it's easier said than done. It's very difficult, but sometimes you got to do make difficult decisions for the for the future of your country. Now, Japan, don't kid anyone. This is like the Netherlands of a long time ago. It's a declining power. Right? Japanese influence will wane. I think Chinese influence will also wane. So I think we need a policy of outlasting China. I mean, what happens? We have democracy, so we have a relatively smooth transition of power. What happens to China? Xi Jinping, this guy's a dictator. He's an emperor. What happens after he's gone? And look at Chinese history as a guide. Whenever there's a strong man, strong emperor, once he's gone, there's chaos, right? So I think we just need to outlast China, and we need to really come together. I got a question for Dr. Watanabe, and that is, you mentioned Quad Plus. I think that's going down the wrong road. I mean, Quad Plus might be good for diseases and whatnot, pandemics, but I think it's like the 5-power treaty after the Washington Treaty Conference. It just waters down what's really important. And so, because ROK, and this is where I agree with Professor Sato. ROK. Are they taking the path that we want them to take? It seems that that Moon Jae-in is going to sell out the country. And so, gosh, if I were Korean now, I would be very, very disappointed. And also, this is how I'm going to end. We need to put our feet in the shoes of the Chinese. And if I were Chinese, or a Chinese academic, or whatever Chinese government, I'd be very proud of what my country's doing. I'd be thumping my chest, and I'm like, hey, man, you guys, your democracies are weak. You've all messed up. It's our time under the sun now, right? And that's how I'd feel. I'd be very confident. Okay, and confidence leads to arrogance. Sometimes this could lead to aggression. So that's what I worry. And so, believe me, I really hope that I'm wrong, but I think we need to prepare in the event that things don't turn out positively. So with that, I'd like to end. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, no, don't just end. I still have a little more to put before you and the next two speakers. And so this
I'm sorry. I thought we'd give her
Don't worry. Just stay there. Don't mute your mic just as yet. So I have my colleague, Mr. Rajkumar Srivastav, the Deputy Chief of Mission in our embassy in Japan. So now he's made 2 points here, and I want you and the next two speakers to reflect on them. Of course, the first speaker can also come in anytime he wants to. And so Raj says, Japan has started looking at economic security with new institutional setups within the NSS. Is this a sign of decoupling? Is decoupling really coming around the corner between Japan and China, and also that Japan has come out with some recent regulations on protecting digital infrastructure, health infrastructure, the takeover of companies, poaching, as in, predatory and vulture funds coming in, poaching of talent also. Now, if President Trump comes back to power, this could become, a faster process. I mean, what are your views? That's what he said here. I have one or two more questions. Let me just try and do justice to them. Is Japan just kicking the can down the road, fearing economic consequences? I assume from China. That's from Anand Kumar. What can India do more to attract Japanese investments, especially SMEs who have shied away, in his view? And then Dr. Jagannath Panda, who has helped set up this thing, so I thank him for the initiative that he took to reach out to each one of you. So Jagannath, my grateful thanks to you for all the work that you put in. Now he says, is it very early to ask this question? To what extent would Japan like to see Donald Trump getting re-elected? Would Tokyo like to see the Democrats coming to power? I think at this stage I must stop, otherwise we'll not be able to utilize the rest of our time. So please pick up the threads, Minohara-san, and another minute or two from you, and then I'll quickly go over to the other speakers.
No, I don't think the decoupling is around the corner. I mean, it's down the horizon for sure, but it's not going to be an instant process unless America stomps its feet and says, hey, you can no longer trade with China. Like for Japan, it's very difficult to trade with Iran at the moment because of American pressure. So it could happen in a drastic way, but it's just based on Japanese initiative. No, it's going to be a long, drawn-out process. But it's happening. You see Japanese companies either shifting their production back to Japan or going to other countries. And perhaps India can be one of those countries in which Japan could have closer economic ties. I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is with this COVID, I mean, this is going to sound dreadful, but there are some positives. And then the positives is that, well, one, you get to spend a lot more time with your family. But putting that aside, it's the fact that Japanese diplomacy was put on hold. And I was really worried with the direction of Japanese foreign policy, this rapprochement with China, the panda hugging, or maybe the Winnie the Pooh hugging, approaching Putin. I mean, to me, I was like, oh my gosh, what happened to the principles of Japanese foreign policy? Where are you headed? And with this COVID, it sort of paused everything. And it made the Japanese realize, at least the Japanese public, true Chinese nature. And therefore, this post-COVID, I think Japanese approach to China will be probably more measured and more cautious. That's what I'm hoping for. And so it really bought some really valuable time for Japan. Now, the question about elections, I mean, who knows who's going to win? Incumbent is always is in an advantageous position, but the economy is tanking. No, it's going to boil down to the electoral college. Trump is not going after the popular vote; he's going to go after the states the swing states, and who knows what's going to happen. But I'll tell you this much: I think from in the perspective of the Japanese government, but I think normally or rationally, you would probably want Trump to be in power, and this is, of course, not factoring American domestic politics. Okay, we're putting that aside. Because Trump is unknown. Okay? In a very twisted way, he's unpredictable, yet he's predictable. Where Biden, he has yet to prove himself. We have no idea where he's going to go. He doesn't really, he's probably going to bring in some really good people to support him, advise him, but we just don't have the details. Now, with Trump, I mean, we know the general direction. Now, the thing is, again, in a very twisted way, Trump is sort of like the brakes to this American car. And the people who are stepping on the gas are people like Pompeo and Pence, and these guys are vehemently anti-China. And so, I guess what's interesting to see how much influence they will have on Trump. And now Trump he wanted to have that deal with China. He doesn't want to slug it out with China, but I don't think that's the case with Pence and Pompeo and company, right? And once they start having a greater influence, again, I think the situation could take a turn for the worse much quicker than we think. But in that thing, I think Trump, this is going to sound really awkward, but Trump can be managed. He can be managed, and he's not a guy who wants war. That's one thing I'll give him credit for. All right, so
thanks a lot. Thanks for your additional comments there. I will now request Mr. Watanabe to comment on all this that has been said by previous speakers and the questions that have been raised. Mr. Watanabe, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think that I pick up several. I think, but the Professor Minohara said a very important work for the Japan's policy, especially the COVID-19 reaction, not proactive, very reactive things, but somehow good result. I think that may explain Japan's policy. I don't think Japan, especially Japanese bureaucratic, making a very decisive decision. I think try to be ready for anything. Trump or Biden, anything. And NSC has a now new economic team. I think especially the economic statecraft team, they said. And I talked with several members. I think, of course, no direct, strong direction, but clearly, they are watching a serious U.S.-China conflict may come, especially decoupling may come. Probably not perfect decoupling. They prefer the use of a partial disengagement. That is some buzzword. But clearly, some people ask the 5G too. I think some critical technology related one should be shut down and by order of the U.S. side. And Japan cannot say no. But at the same time, Japan cannot completely separate our economy from China. So trying to find some way between. And by the way, the US is also too. Vice President Pence's speech last year, he said some condition, but no decoupling. I think impossible for US too. But some kind of strategic partial disengagement is possible. So I think Japan's new addition to the NSC would be treating with difficult U.S.-China economic partial disengagement, decoupling competition, and how adjust Japan itself to such kind of competition to survive. Again, that's very reaction-based, but I need to some idea. And
so let me interrupt you there. I mean, when you speak of this partial decoupling, are you really referring to taking a page out of the Chinese book? Because the Chinese have been pretty good at partial decoupling for strategic reasons. It's like saying that we have a little bump in the East, China Sea and over the Senkakus, and we will stop all exports of rare earths to Japan. I mean, to my mind, that's strategic partial decoupling. So I suppose that the United States will also look at such opportunities. Would you say partial decoupling is of that nature? That will be aimed against China.
What I'm talking about is the U.S. side partial disengagement, the partial decoupling. I think I try to stop flow of very critical technology to the military related or critical seed for the growing industry. I think that's U.S. side. And of course, China is also thinking.
Yeah. So it's a game that two can play. Yes, that's right.
Mm-hmm. So Japan's play would be the very complex. I think U.S. intention and the Chinese intention try to find some suitable position for the Japan to survive. I think
you did a little bit of that vis-a-vis the Republic of Korea, as you remember last year. On the trade side, I mean, Japan went strategic in terms of a deliberate, planned partial decoupling in a particular sector to convey a message. Yeah. So I think that's kind of emerging as a new norm also. I mean, you can't decouple your relationship in an entirety, but you can always pick and choose where you will work and where you will not work so that it hurts and the message goes home.
Yeah, that's right. I think you picked up last year the Japan's South Korea's trouble. That's very serious because it's related to the semiconductor issue. And I think China is not yet catching up full scale of semiconductor technology to make it possible. So some way China really needed to such kind of technology, and some way US really wanted to prevent. Japan is between. So watching how US-China relation going to. By the way, I think a bureaucratic approach of Japan is also answer to the Dr. Panda's question, Trump or Biden. And very skillful Japanese diplomats, former ambassador to US, Ichiro Fujisaki, he once said some interesting joke. Before the US delegation of US Congress, bipartisan congressmen and women. US president is like a Christmas present. Never open the box and open up. And that's what I wanted to. So that's never predict which one is better or good. And trying to adjust itself either to the Trump or the Biden. That is the basic Japan's mind setting. And of course, good and bad for the Trump, good and bad for the Biden. But anyway, now we are entered in the very unpredictable phase of US and other world. So we need to be ready for any hedge. I stop.
Thank you for your comments. There are, of course, many people who have asked this question. I can see here that Professor Shabani Roy Chowdhury had also asked a question. Can Japan really move out of China? So you see, people have some, kind of doubts also at the end of the day. Professor Shabani Roy Chowdhury wants to know, will it go the Seikei Bunri way again? So I think I can request the next speaker to maybe take a look at this issue. I now turn to Professor Yoichiro Sato. And by the way, I want to come back to Isomura-san because some questions I raised after you had spoken. So I don't want to be unfair to you. I'll come back to you and get a couple of bites out of you as well. So Professor Sato, please.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think Japan cannot completely kind of decouple with China. I mean, in the first place, Japan, expanded, the economic linkage with China largely as a response to this, prolonged U.S.-Japan trade dispute. I mean, Japan fought the trade war, from 1960s on, and in 1995, with WTO coming into place and the U.S. and Japan made a kind of investment deal in the car sector, then they kind of entered a ceasefire period in terms of trade war. So, but now Trump is, people talk about Trump declaring a trade war against China, but actually this trade war is against East Asia more broadly. And, Japan is under pressure for, negotiating bilateral trade agreement, and, India faced some pressure, even Vietnam, currently US is approaching Vietnam for security relationship, but, on trade issues, Vietnam and the US have trade disputes. So, in that sense, why should Japan give up China to toe the line with the US? Japan is not going to do that. And I also saw a question from my friend Titri. It's about Japan and the World Health Organization. Just yesterday so the news report was saying that Japan, China, South Korea, 3 countries' health ministers together expressed support for WHO. And the timing of this announcement is really significant because, the Trump is putting pressure on WHO and threatening to pull the budget and possibly, launching a new international multilateral organizations if Taiwan's, observer status is not accepted and so forth. And, Japan is actually, talking to the Chinese, and then the China announced that China will accept the, the investigation by the WHO. So I think Japan's really playing this kind of bridging role between China on one hand and the US on the other, and to save the WHO-centered, health multilateralism.
Thank you, Professor Sato. May I come back to Mr. Isomura for a minute or two, if you wish to reflect on some of the questions that were raised after you had spoken?
Actually, maybe you're concerned about the relationship between Japan and ROK, South Korea. And simply I can say that was quite bad marriage and quite bad divorce. And marriage in 1910, and the divorce is just after the Second World War. So unfortunately, that is a quite similar relation between India and Pakistan. And my colleague wrote a book, Why We Can't Be Just Friends. And unfortunately, we can't. Very emotional. Sometimes hate each other. And the problem of Northeast Asia is distrustness each countries. So important thing is how to build a sort of trust relations between Japan, China, South Korea, North Korea, Russia. That would be very important. And we have to consider about that. And also, just in the beginning, I talked about the offset program in India. Japan, the Abe and Prime Minister Modi agreed about the amphibious airplane US-2, but that haven't moved forward. It's very, very difficult and takes a long time. And also, thirdly, I have to mention that the relationship between Abe and Trump, they have very good relations. So if Trump continue and Abe continue their position now, so it's rather difficult between just take a position between China and United States. That's all. Thank you.
Well, this really brings us to the end of what has been a very, very interesting and exciting discussion with a number of eminent panelists throwing light on a very broad array of issues. And we had to kind of telescope all these issues into the short span of, less than 2 hours. We're not yet into 2 hours. And we covered quite a lot. But if I were to take a message at the end of all this from the summaries that you presented and some of the questions that you took, one is that everybody wants to send a strong message to Beijing, it seems, that there are things that they can do and things that they should not be doing. The other is no dispute over the fact that we must all support ASEAN, and notably India and Japan can always come together to do more. Japan with its expanded partnership for quality infrastructure, and India with its Act East policy. There's scope there for us to do something together to get ASEAN to show, if I may put it quite bluntly, a little more spine in dealing with China as well. Now, Japan, seldom proactive, mostly reactive. This is something that I did not say, but some of the panelists did say that. And so that really, sort of pinpoints the light on the fact that Japan really needs to do more, can do more, is immensely capable of doing more on all fronts. It's a question of building that kind of consensus in domestic political opinion as well, considering that the LDP is itself not a monolith. If ASEAN is not a monolith, nor is the LDP. I mean, Japan doesn't have multi-party, sort of democracy. It has kind of almost a single-party democracy. That's because the LDP has so many factions. It's really like an amalgamation of so many viewpoints, pro, anti, all kinds of things. So, but the short message there, Japan can, must, and is intensely and immensely capable of doing more. So more power to your elbow if you can really step up to the plate and be a little more proactive. I personally think there was a message there that Chinese influence will wane. Now, I'm not suggesting this in a churlish sort of manner, but the point is that there is so much reaction, adverse reaction to this so-called rise of China, which I think China has not handled very well. It's been wanting in terms of the actions that it has taken to prove reassuring in terms of its own rise. And this is going to be all the more difficult for China achieving greatness in a world that is A, in flux, and B, where power on all axes is completely fractured today. So it's not a ready-made situation where, the United States is expected to, sort of quietly fade and go away, and China steps up to some kind of, greatness and becomes a great power. As I said earlier in my own remarks, it's an age in which you may not see the emergence of any one great power. We've seen that even the United States, the largest economy, most formidable, R&D and technological and innovation capabilities, is sharing that power today more than ever before. And in the case of China, this is going to be a question mark as to what happens beyond Xi Jinping, because today we are associating everything, whether it is Chinese aggressiveness, whether it is unilateralism, whether it is fait accompli in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, whether it is made in China campaign, BRI. The word BRI didn't come up, but all this is associated with Xi Jinping, but he doesn't have a successor. So we have no doubt that China as a civilization is expected to go on and on and on. But what happens in terms of internal politics in China is food for thought as we look ahead. Will the Belt and Road become China's Waterloo? Who knows? I don't. So let us agree to meet again in the not too distant future and to exchange views again. Till then, let us all try and build greater engagement and, as you put it, greater trust in all the various parts of the Indo-Pacific theater, so that it truly becomes a more inclusive concept, one that is conducive to building peace and prosperity for the entire length and breadth of the Indo-Pacific region. We want greater multipolarity, not only at the global level, but also in Asia. What's good for the goose is equally good for the gander. So let's work towards greater multipolarity, if possible, also a little more multilateralism, which is wanting a short supply these days. But I really want to thank all our panelists from the bottom of my heart for having spared so much of their valuable time. The Shinkansen took off on time, but it seems to have arrived at its station a little after time. And certainly not blaming the Japanese for that. As the moderator today, I will take blame for that. And I am so glad you have also kept up and borne the past 2 hours with such equanimity. Thank you very much for your enthusiasm. And I wish you all a very good evening, a very good morning, wherever you are, and good health always. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.